Welcome to Faith and Culture with Pastor Dave, a podcast where we answer your spiritual questions and address cultural events.
Howdy and welcome to the podcast. Hey, today we're going to talk about civil disobedience. This is a hot topic right now. You've probably seen on the news the protests that are happening against ICE in Minnesota, New York City. Well, there's always protests. Somebody's protesting something somewhere all the time in the United States, of course. But I got a question Sunday that I wanted to kind of focus on and hone in on. So let me read that to you. It's a great question, and many of you probably been asking the same question. I know I've got it from several people, this whole idea of how do we respond to this. So here's the question. Here's what they wrote. Here it is. Jesus often avoided public confrontation, even when tensions were high. In today's politically charged climate around issues like ICE or socialism, how should Christians discern whether to remain quiet, protest peacefully, or take direct action? What guides that decision biblically? All right. Actually, just to address a little part of that question, Jesus didn't always avoid public confrontation. Sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't. So just be clear about that. I mean, think about the time Jesus went to the temple and turned everything over. And lots of times Jesus called the church leaders like whitewashed tombs and sort of thing. So there were times where he did that, but other times he didn't, okay? Actually, I don't think there's one time that he did anything against the government, but it was really against the church. But with that in mind, let's talk about civil disobedience today and the filter by which you can determine whether we should protest something or disobey a law or be upset with something. Now, this is a complicated issue, as you can imagine. There are good people on both sides of these issues. So today, I don't think I can tell you exactly what is right or wrong about any particular civil disobedience necessarily, although we'll touch on that. What I really want to give you is like what she said at the end of her question, like what is the biblical guide by which we filter these things through? Okay, so we're going to talk about that. There's a great passage that I'm going to read to you from Romans 13. So today's a podcast, but it's also a little bit Bible study, I suppose. So enjoy. Romans 13 talks about this. We're going to look at the first 5 verses. I'm going to divvy it up a little bit. And then at the end of where I'm going is to give you the filter by which you determine, or Christians should determine, whether we should protest something or have some sort of civil disobedience in us, okay? And that'll help us all to determine what's going on in Minnesota or New York or any other protest that you know of and how we can filter it through, okay? So this Romans 13, I'll read you the 5 verses and then we'll kind of break it out a little bit. Here's what he says. Paul says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God." All right. "Consequently, whoever rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. And those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right. Okay. But for those who do wrong, do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right." Okay. That's powerful. "And you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it's necessary to submit the authorities to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience." All right, so let's talk about our relationship with the government. It says at the beginning there, "Let everyone be subject to governing authorities." Okay, that means presidents, Congress, mayors, governors, judges, cops, firemen, city council, kings, all these, anybody who's been given some sort of governmental authority and oversight, that's who he's talking about, okay? But I think it also goes beyond that in a Christian perspective. I think he's also talking about anybody in authority over you can also fit into this realm, but we're going to talk about governmental authority specifically. But this probably also applies to parents and teachers and coaches and bosses and HOA leaders, anybody kind of in an authority position. But really, we're just talking about governmental authority, so let's make sure we're clear on that. So what is Paul asking us to do? What is God asking us to do? He's asking us to submit to governmental authorities, to obey them. He says to be subject to them. Now, here's what I've noticed about me, and it's probably true for you too. I'm all for authority. especially when I'm in authority, right? I love authority when I'm in authority. And when I'm in authority, I think everybody should respond positively to authority, right? And you think the same thing, right? So we like verse, like husbands love that verse. Wives, submit to your husbands. We love that one, right? Or children, obey your parents. We like that one, right? We like those verses. When we're authority, when we're in authority, we want people to respect authority, of course. Yeah, and I'm having fun with you here. But when we're under authority, we find lots of reasons to not respect authority. We sure do. We just sometimes don't want people to tell us what to do. We want to buck the system when we think we know better, and we see that all around the country. And the question really is, when is that right? When is that wrong? Now, let me tell you some reasons why I think that we, at least we as Christians, and some of this is particular to Christians, some of it's just in general, but let me tell you about why we have this desire in us to resist against authority. Why we have this desire or inclination to not do what Romans is telling us to be subject to governmental authorities. Okay, number one is sin. By definition, sin is rebellion over law or authority, really God's law. But our first instinct when come up against a law, God's law or some law we don't like or that bothers us, is to push back, to bristle. We argue, we disagree, we disobey, we disregard. We do that. I've done that, right? Because sin wants to make us autonomous. Sin wants to make us, we don't want to be under authority when we're in sin. This is Satan's fundamental problem, and it all began right there. Satan didn't want to be under the authority of God. That's where it begins, okay? So sin is the first reason why we resist. Another reason, I think really for us Christians, this doesn't apply to everybody, okay? But if you're a Protestant, I think there's something in there that might need to be addressed, because the word Protestant, it comes from the word protest. We are protesting the leadership of the Catholic Church. That's where Protestantism comes from. We still are in protest against them. Much of what they're doing, I believe, is deceived teaching. It is wrong in so many ways. There are good Christian people in the Catholic Church. Don't misunderstand me. That I addressed that on a previous podcast. Okay, so there are brothers and sisters in Christ, but we still are in protest against a bunch of the thoughts. So we're Protestants. A third thing, and this probably applies to everybody, is we're Americans, and America started with a revolutionary war. We revolted. That's where the word revolutionary comes from. We revolted against the King of England and all their policies. We didn't want to be under their rule anymore. We revolted, we fought, and then we wrote a Declaration of Independence. And there's just something in the DNA of Americans that we just don't want to, we want to revolt. We want to protest at times. It's just who we are. That's why we're like the cowboys. The rest of the world looks at us like we're cowboys. And that's true, I suppose, to some degree, or to some large degree. Another reason we don't want to submit to governmental authorities or authority is sometimes it's just personality. Not everybody has a oppositional personality, but lots of people do. Some people even have a thing called ODD, oppositional defiant disorder. Maybe you have that. Maybe you think you know somebody who does. That they just kind of they defy authority all the times, Who knows? Some of us, a lot of us just have a little Slim Shady in us, right? I'm kind of that guy. And some people just want to fight the man. It's amazing how many songs in our culture are about that. Like Public Enemy, it was a rap group then when I was growing up. They had that famous song called Fight the Power. Remember that? Or The Clash has their famous song, I Fought the Law and the Law Won. Or John Cougar Mellencamp, I fought authority, and authority always wins. So there's always songs about fighting authority, and they're still around. The last reason I have the reason which we tend to fight authority and not be subject to governmental authorities is when we focus on the what rather than the who. Because our disagreements with authority, it usually comes from focusing on what we're being asked to do. Not always by whom it's being asked, although that's a whole other thing. But most of our disagreements just come from what we're asked to do, from what we're asked to do. Like you may be at work and they've given you a policy that you disagree with. It just sounds silly and stupid, and you're like, I don't want to do that policy. It's not that you hate your boss, but the policy seems to be ridiculous to you, right? Or maybe a posted speed limit in your town or your commute just seems to be too slow or too fast, and you just disagree with it. You don't disagree with the cops who put it down. but you just don't like the speed limit. Or maybe there's maybe sharing medication. You shouldn't do that, but some people do that. Or littering, or sharing Netflix passwords. You're not supposed to do that. Maybe you disagree with that. I told my church there's a stoplight right outside my entrance to my neighborhood that I just hate, and I've run it a few times. To be honest, I'm not going to confess anymore here online about that. But there you go. The point is this. If we think rules are stupid or unimportant or wrong, we don't follow them. And I think something in us, we can't say this out loud, but I think we're just assuming that God would agree with us. Yeah, God's on my side. That's a dumb policy. That's a dumb thing, But when it comes to authority, we tend to evaluate what we're being asked to do, but God looks at it differently. That's what Romans is saying. God says it's all about the who and not the what. Now, but some of the leaders in our government now and have always been in any other government, this, there are some leaders, some politicians, some kings, some rulers that are hard to obey and not worth obeying. That is true. Now, when Paul wrote this, Romans 13, he wrote it, he did not write this during a time of utopia when everything was just fine and it was easy to obey the rulers. No, because Nero was in charge when he wrote this. Nero was a bad dude, okay? Nero did not play nice with Christians. He burnt the city and he blamed the Christians. Actually, you know what he did with Christians? I've heard, that he would take Christians and he would douse them in oil and stick them on a big impaled stick and he would burn them as big tiki torches. He was a bad dude. Fed them to the lions. He's the one who eventually would behead Paul. So when Paul wrote this, he was in a time where there was a bad leader in place, and he still wrote this because it comes from God. It probably was hard to write, but he wrote it. And Nero was in charge of the government, right? And so Paul is thinking, we should obey this guy, and the people reading the Romans to begin with, we got to pay this guy? Interestingly enough, Paul was under house arrest by the government of Rome at this time. And we're pretty sure that he knew Caesar would read this. And he was want to make sure that Nero, who was the leader at that time, would know that Christians are not anarchists. There you go. But you probably have somebody in authority over you. Maybe you have a boss or a leader or a mayor or a congressman or a president or I don't know what you think, okay? That somebody may make you question this verse. Seriously, we should obey them. Why? Well, it said there, if you saw that, that there is no authority that exists that God has not established. God has established all authority. That means God works through those in authority. God is the source of all authority, okay? And he's given some of that authority to those in leadership. They're appointed by God in leadership. In the Bible, we read of kings and prophets and priests who all have authority. Jesus himself said that he submits to the Father's authority. He's under the authority. But the Bible just continues to affirm that we're to respect governmental authorities. Wives are to respect husband's authority. Kids are to respect parental authority. Employees are to respect boss's authority. That's all throughout Ephesians and Colossians. But we live in a society that struggles with authority. We do. There aren't many movements that I know of. Actually, I don't know of a single movement that's all designed around respecting authority and personal restraint. The movements that we hear are actually against authority. But anyways, the point I'm trying to make here that I think Paul is saying is that there is innate and derived authority. Innate authority. God is the only one who has innate authority. He just has it, okay? Any other authority is authority that has been given by God to somebody. We have derivative authority. A government does not have innate authority. It has derivative authority. A father doesn't have innate authority. It's derivative, given to him by God. All human authority is derivative authority. It's borrowed from God. It's on loan from God. So think about your life. Who are you in authority over? Or in your life, who are you over? That authority has been given to you by God. Or who is in authority over you? Their authority has been given to them by God. Now, do they make mistakes? Absolutely. And many actually, governmental authorities throughout history have been terrible and have abused this authority. You think of Hitler and Stalin and Saddam Hussein and Nero and many others. I mean, I don't want to that list would take forever to come up with because they are sinful and they make bad decisions. And sometimes they use their leadership to lead in God-honoring ways, and sometimes they don't. And they make mistakes. The answer is not to get rid of government. That's clearly not biblical, but to improve it. And sometimes we need to protest against it. When do we do that? Well, we'll talk about that. But in verse 2, he says this. Look at this. Consequently, whoever rebels against authority is rebelling what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. What is he saying? To rebel against authority, make no mistake, is to rebel against God, because God has given them authority. I know that's hard to grasp, especially when there's a leader who's so bad, but that's what it is. Now, we'll talk about civil disobedience in just a minute, but God always works through human authority, and he works through good human authority, and he works through bad human authority. He does. Now, the first rebellion against authority, you know what it was? It was Satan in heaven. Satan in heaven ran the first no kings event. He did. He protested against God. He said, you're not going to be the king. I want to be the king. And he revolted with a third of the angels, and they leave heaven. This is a real thing, okay? They revolted. It was the first no kings event, and every one since has been always satanic driven, okay? But they wanted to have no authority, no king over them, no leadership, and they leave. And then they go to the Garden of Eden and do the same thing there. They just spread it into the Garden of Eden. Because Satan says to Eve, hey, let's talk about this rule, this law that God has put in place about not eating from the tree of knowledge. I know God said this. I know God said this rule, but Eve, does this even make sense to you? He wasn't really challenging, well, he was challenging God, but to Eve, he was challenging the rule, like the what. You know, we do that. And that's it. We think we're addressing the what, but we're really rebelling against the who. So yeah, evidently they thought the rule against eating the fruit was dumb, and they thought they were rebelling just against the rule, but they were not. They were rebelling against God. And when you rebel against authority, you are in fact rebelling against God. That means if I disobey my parents, I'm ultimately rebelling against God. If I disobey my boss or my coach or my government or anybody in authority over me, the cops, the leaders, the ICE agents, the mayors, if I'm rebelling against them, then I am ultimately rebelling and sinning against God. Don't make the same mistake that Adam and Eve made, thinking, this is a dumb rule and it'll be fine. God's with us because it's a dumb rule. No, they were rebelling against God. And when we rebel against the governmental authority, we are doing exactly the same thing. You cannot come to any other conclusion on Romans 13 except that. I know it's difficult to hear, but we cannot separate, we cannot get away from that. We can't say, God, I love you, and then turn and rebel against authority over us. We just can't do that. Those things cannot be separated. Your response to human authorities is direct reflection of your response to God's authority. The human authorities that you can see are a reflection of how you respond, how you worship God whom you cannot see. Okay? This is why it's important for parents to teach your kids to obey. So important for kids to learn that, okay? Because kids who disobey their parents will probably eventually disobey leaders over them and ultimately God. And that's a problem. That's a systemic problem in America. Then he says this, for rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Of course, if you don't do anything wrong, you're not going to get shot by the police or arrested or put in jail. You're not going to be. I know some people think you will, but I disagree with that. But those who do wrong, yeah, you should be afraid of getting arrested, getting tased, getting put in jail. I mean, that's what it says. I think we understand that, right? Now, you're driving down the street, you're obeying the speed limit, and for some reason there's a cop behind you, he's just driving too. Doesn't that terrorize you? Doesn't 10 and 2, my hands are on 10 and 2 because there's a cop behind me. And that's because we know that they have authority, right? But if you do what is right, you don't have any fear of authorities over you. But if you do what is wrong, you should in fact be afraid, okay? When Christians are responsible citizens, it allows us to worship more freely and privately because we're not picking fights with the government unnecessarily, okay? Then he says, for the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, again, be afraid. For rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. God's servant, okay? They're God's servant. Your boss, according to this passage, is God's servant. Your coach is God's servant. Your teacher, the governor, your parents, Congress, the president, the Supreme Court. These guys are God's servants. How does that work? How are they God's servants? I know when you hear that, some of you think, seriously? How do we reconcile that? Well, let me explain a theological phrase. It's called common grace. That God gives some things generally to all of us as a common grace for everybody. There are specific graces for Christians that are triggered when you're in obedience to God, yes. But there are common graces that are for all of us that we get to experience. Like air, breathing air, that's a common grace from God to give us all life. Rain, sunshine, we all get that. The Bible says the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. It's a common grace. But government also, even though it can be a burden, is a common grace. It's there for all of us. And it really has two grand reasons, I think, according to Scripture. Number one, to protect the community. And number two, to punish criminals. Got those two things, to protect the community, punish criminals. Now let's talk about, for example, defunding the police. Haven't heard a lot about that lately, but that's the world I live in, I guess. Some people want to defund the police, get rid of ICE. Even in Minnesota, they're saying we won't follow you, we won't listen to you, you can't be in here, just trying to get rid of authority. You know, that's a terrible idea, to get rid of police and authority and those kind of leaders. The idea is to decriminalize some things and defund some things and let people police themselves. This leads to destruction, okay? If we decriminalize the behavior and we defend if we decriminalize the behavior and we defend law enforcement, the assumption is that life will get better, but it does not. It gets worse. If we get rid of all the police, do you think things would be good? No way, because again, we are living in a culture where people have a proclivity to rebel. If there's no justice system, no police, no courts, no ICE agents, no jails, people will simply take justice in their own hands and vengeance and retribution will reign. This is exactly what Satan desires. You know what's worse than a bad cop is no cop, okay? Now, if you were to defund the police and there were no police on the streets, you might not even make it home from work today. Who knows, right? Okay, that's hyperbole, but you get the idea. There would be total anarchy eventually without laws and without those to uphold and enforce the laws. This is why God has given governmental authorities to protect and punish, and they are a common grace for all of us and necessary for all of us. And yes, sometimes they do it improperly and bad, and that includes some ICE agents and some police agents, for sure, and governmental leaders, but it's only a few. Most of them do not act in an inappropriate manner. But he says this, if you do wrong, be afraid. Yeah, be afraid because they have authority to put you in jail, to arrest you, okay? So let's talk about civil disobedience. Now, with all that in mind, that's really the setup to, this is the answer to your question. When then is it okay to have civil disobedience, to disobey against God? Against God's authority. When is it okay to disobey or protest against the police or ICE agents or a government? When is it okay? And there are times when it's okay. Now, in our nation, we've had several examples in history that have been civil disobedience. The Boston Tea Party, for example, right? How about Susan B. Anthony? She was arrested for voting. You know her name? She's on is it the Silver Dollar? She's one of those coins. She's a famous person because she was one of the first women to vote, and she got arrested for it, civil disobedience. How about Rosa Parks, who wouldn't sit in the back of the bus? She revolted and civil disobedience. We know her name. Martin Luther King Jr. also won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1955 for civil disobedience. Do you remember too? Was this the 80s or 90s? I forget exactly. I think it was in high school, so late 80s. Was Tank Man. Remember Tank Man? In Tiananmen Square in China, the guy who stood in front of the tanks to civilly disobey the government, and he put his life literally on the line to be run over by these tanks. Anyway, so you get the idea. Because sometimes, let me say it this way, safely, with some caveats. Sometimes Romans 13 doesn't work. Sometimes leaders or Governments are so misaligned and so sinful and so wrong that we simply cannot obey them. Here's when that works. It does. Romans 13 doesn't work when being a good Christian, which means being a good citizen, means being a bad Christian. Did I say that right? Being a good Christian means being a good citizen until being a good citizen means being a bad Christian. That's a trigger for civil disobedience. This was the case in the 30s and 40s with Nazi Germany and in that country. This was the case today in China with their one-child policy. This was the case during the U.S. Civil War, and many people rebelled against the ownership of slaves, obviously. This was the case in North Korea, where you can't be a Christian today, and they rebel. So when should we not obey authority, and how should we do it? That's really the question. I think we all agree that, yes, Romans 13 is right. We should obey authority. But when they're bad, when they're evil, when something happens, when should we not obey, and how should we do it? Let me preface this. The kingdom of God is one of order and harmony. The kingdom of Satan is one of disorder and anarchy. Okay? Civil disobedience is the opposite of anarchy. Anarchy is trying to destroy the law, but civil disobedience is appealing to God's law. So think about a couple years ago, January 6th. Remember that whole insurrection? Was it an insurrection or civil disobedience? Great question. What about Bonhoeffer, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a Christian pastor and was a part of the assassination attempt on Hitler? Was that civil disobedience, or was he sinning? How about today in Minnesota? People who are revolting against ICE. Is that civil disobedience? Is it not? That's the question of the day. Here's what happens. If you don't like the authority that you're under, if you don't like your mayor, your boss, or your president, or your Congress, if you don't like them, you might want to change things so bad that you might compromise your integrity to get that change. And that happens a lot. This can be overt, like people posting stuff on social media or picketing, blocking traffic, or it can be covert, like office politics or giving somebody the silent treatment or rumors at work or the gossip mill, I want you to know this, Christians. If a mob is forming, you don't have to grab a pitchfork and join in. You simply don't. Remember, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas showed up with a mob trying to betray Jesus. Not every mob is good and godly and worth judging or worth joining. Civil disobedience happens in one of two ways. Number one, when the government commands you to do something that God forbids. Or number two, when the government forbids something that God commands. Make sense? Now, I'll give you a couple examples. In the book of Daniel, Old Testament, Daniel would not eat the food that he was told to eat. He was captured and put into captivity in Babylon, and he wouldn't eat the food. And he also wouldn't pray to King Darius. And even though they said anyone who doesn't do this will be thrown in the lion's den. Well, he doesn't do that. He doesn't eat their food, and then he doesn't pray. He kept praying to God. He even threw the windows open on his balcony so everybody could see. This was an open act of disobedience to the civil authority, and it was a public act of putting God before the king's decree. That's what he did. And he was thrown into the lion's den. This civil disobedience. How about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Again, they lived at the same time of Daniel. King Nebuchadnezzar builds a 300-foot statue of himself and tells everybody you got to bow down and worship when the big bell rings. Everybody bows down except these three guys. They say, we'll honor the king. We can honor you, but we will not worship you. So they didn't bow down, and they got thrown in the fiery furnace, okay, and they were saved. How about in Exodus? The midwives were told by Pharaoh that whenever any of the Israelite women have baby boys, throw them in the Nile River, drown them, kill them. We don't want them to have so many baby boys grow up that they have this big army. And there are many, there are many midwives, obviously. And in Exodus, we learn of two midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. We actually have their names because God honors their obedience to him. They disobey against Pharaoh, and they save baby Moses, who goes up to lead the nation out of slavery, right? And then Mary and Joseph, how about them? When Pharaoh was killing all the babies, what did they do? Rather than submitting to the government, they changed their citizenship and went to Egypt. They were immigrants themselves. And then when the political regime changed, they came home, okay? So there are lots of examples in the Bible. And The point is, Daniel was forbidden to do something. Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego was told to do something. The midwives were told to do something. If the authority over you commands what God forbids or forbids what God commands, then you must not obey. That's the trigger. Now, here's a caveat. In our culture, they don't make us sin. I don't think our culture makes us sin or keeps us from obeying God, at least in our culture, right? Our culture allows us to sin. They even make it legal in lots of places, which is terrible. But just because something is illegal doesn't make it right. Like divorce or greed or envy or adultery, they're legal, but they're not right. Just to be clear. And lastly, I want to say this before we wrap it. We as Christians obey the law. We do. If you want to not be shot or run over or arrested, then obey the law. You should obey the law. There's ways to disobey civilly without getting to that level of defiance. And he even says, if you do what's right, you won't live in fear of authority unless, of course, they are asking you to do something sinful. Okay? That's the filter by which we run these things through. So we obey the law. Somebody who's 13 should not be taken to an R-rated movie, right? Somebody who's 12 should not be bought a 17 plus video game for Christmas, right? You shouldn't share your medications with somebody. If it's illegal, then it's clearly not to participate. So we can mourn lives like those lost in Minnesota, and that's terrible. None of us want that, and that should never have happened. We can mourn those lives without celebrating lawlessness. And we can affirm borders without dehumanizing immigrants. And we can call for justice without baptizing rage. So, again, I can't tell you specifically how the Minnesota civil disobedience should go, but I don't think the chaos and anarchy is the way to go. I think they're going about it wrong. If you live according to biblical principles, there is a manner in which you can civilly disobey, and that's what I wanted to give you today to help you think this through from a biblical perspective. Hey, thanks for watching today, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
We'll be back next Wednesday to share more about faith and culture with Pastor Dave.